Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Stowe, and I'm so glad that you chose to join us this evening for a very special discussion with our community and those who are part of our law enforcement leadership here in Montgomery County. We have in front of you today a chance to not only talk with persons, but also get a chance to hear from them about how they feel about our community, and more importantly, how they, in fact, police our community with those who serve with them. I'm very pleased to have with us as well our county executive, Mark Eldridge. I'm going to ask him to bring a few comments as well by way of greetings, as well as our county council president, Sydney Katz, to offer similar comments. Mark?
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to join you tonight. I'm going to change what I was going to say a little bit. I was going to talk about this as a deeply troubling time in our country, but I want to say basically the last 400 years has been a deeply troubling time in our country. We have never dealt with slavery. We have never dealt with 400 years of racism. What makes this particularly difficult is that after a series of killings, the community's been pushed to the breaking point, and once again are saying we are not going to take this anymore. And it's not like it's the first time. This happened in the early 60s. It happened in 67 that led to the Kerner report. Um, this is an ongoing thing. It happened in I guess it was 1992. So this isn't just a deeply troubling time. Our society has deeply troubling problems. And the murder of George Floyd has sparked an outrage and protest, but it could have been Tamir Rice or Eric Garner or anybody else who had been killed in similar and seemingly unjustified ways. Montgomery County's had peaceful demonstrations over the past couple of weeks. I've attended a couple of them. I understand and I empathize with the hurt and anger expressed, and particularly the fear expressed by community members. The fact that people are just terrified, particularly folks in the Black community, terrified of encounters with the police and are primed for thinking that something bad is going to happen is a real sad commentary on where things have gone here. The deaths of Robert White and Finan Berhe are troubling. You can't watch the videos of those two incidents and not ask yourself whether something could have been done differently. And even in the case of Mr. Berhe, where the video lasts, I think, 1 minute and 17 seconds, what's really clear is it starts with shouting and pointing a gun and kind of inexorably leads to its conclusion without any other opportunity or effort to bring about a different ending. And my view after all of this, and I was involved on the council as the chair of the public safety committee. We've seen repeated incidents. We had the Aspen Hill knee incident and the White Oak N-word incident, where it's not just the person who did something wrong, but these people were surrounded by other officers who did nothing at all and simply watched it. And so, my take on this is that we have deep and institutional problems, and it's not just a problem with individual officers. I remind people that almost everybody in all the police forces at higher levels used to be individual officers. The training in our department, some of the things that people consider excessive policing, like pretextual stops, like harassing young Black kids and trying to shake them down to see if they've got pot, those things we're trained for, and those things were encouraged. Giving out tickets is encouraged. I've been told, and the union is pretty pointed about this, when we really did community policing, there were measures in your evaluation that focused on how many community events you went to. Did you play basketball? Did you do things with people in the community? As opposed to a system which evaluates more how many tickets you wrote and how many charges you brought. So we need to deal with the bad apples, but the problem is deeper than bad apples. The problem is how we train, what we expect officers to do. And I say, I agree with people who've pointed out that we ask the police to do too much. We have failed to provide adequate, affordable housing for the people who really need it. We don't have adequate health care. We have poor wages for particularly people of color. They are stuck economically at the bottom of the ladder. And all these other social constructs contribute to problems that people have, contribute to people's, mental health. We know that poverty is a factor in folks having mental health issues. When you can't find a way out of a situation, you often come to realize there's no bad decisions because you can't make any good decisions. And so we know enough about the complexity of the underlying social problems, and yet we've handed this entire bag to the police department. You're homeless, it's the police. You have an alcohol or drug problem, it's the police. You can't control your temper, it's the police. Whatever it is, it's the police. And we need to start looking at our institutions. I don't think so much about defunding police as much as shifting funding from things they're doing that ought not to be police functions, and finding those resources, placing those resources in other aspects where activities appropriately belong. We need to do a better job of training. We need to have higher expectations. I hope the chief's going to talk. I believe that we have actually negotiated with an agreement with the union on one of the big issues, which is the responsibility of police officers as bystanders to intervene. This is important, and I got notice today that we got an agreement on that. We are going to continue to work with this. My office had money in the budget, and we were ready to let a contract to bring in a consulting firm to look at every aspect of what we do. Our stops, our promotion policies, our training policies, our hiring policies, and what kind of support we give officers in the positive way other than simply discipline. So we're prepared for change. I gotta say, I look forward for the opportunity to do this. And I think everybody has recognized that this is the path that we're gonna have to walk down. I thank you all for having this forum tonight. I think some of you may remember we had a forum, I guess it was last summer, where we were talking about policing, and I think it raised a lot of issues, and a lot of that stuff is what triggered us to look for a consulting firm to dig into the myriad of issues that may exist. And so I want you to know that we are determined to do this. We're determined to make a stronger, better police department that does the job we need them to do, a job in community, not task them with things that other people are better suited to do. And we're going to make sure our residents are safe. They need not to be afraid of police. They need not to be afraid of being treated differently because of the color of their skin. And that is what we are going to set out, and that's what we're going to accomplish. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We now will have our council president, Sidney Katz.
Well, good evening, and thank you, everyone involved in this program. The Office of Human Rights, the Human Rights Commission, and the Committee Against Hate and Violence, I appreciate the efforts that it takes to get everyone here virtually, and I'm pleased that our friend Jim Stowe is the moderator. Montgomery County, along with other communities nationwide, are facing difficult times. We have all faced challenging times before, but this is the worst of times. Sickness and murder, the worst of times. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged us in ways that we have never been challenged before. The murder of George Floyd has brought to the forefront again the urgent need that we as a community and as a country must address. We need to admit the horrors of our past and change our future. We can do this. We must do this. We must focus on the eradication of systemic racism, and we must do it with everyone working together. We are all partners. I sincerely appreciate everyone being here this evening. I know our law enforcement leaders are very troubled about the events that have taken place. When our leaders in law enforcement and the community work together, we all benefit. We need to mention and to thank the many fine police officers whose chiefs are here this evening and beyond for for their concern and their service. Of course, there is much to be done, and I know that in Montgomery County, we are committed to working together to do what needs to be done. I believe a community is a family, and our family is going through the toughest of times. But just like every family during the worst of times, it brings the family together even more to face their problems, face them, and change them. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you for allowing me to say a few words.
Thank you, Council President Katz, very much. Really appreciate that, and want to certainly thank all of our council members. Many of them will be joining us tonight and will be listening in and taking advantage of hearing from the community and also hearing from our law enforcement leaders. I want to make sure we recognize those persons as we are made aware of them being on the line, but we are expecting Councilmember Rice to be a part of the listening audience, Councilmember Albanos to be a member as well. Councilmember Glass will have one of his staff person listening in on his behalf as he had a conflict tonight. And I'm sure there are others that I don't yet know about who are part of this discussion tonight, vis-a-vis through their participation and listening. But as we learn about them, we'll make sure that you are aware of who they are. We want to now go to a little bit about why we're doing this, our sponsorship of the program, and as well as to give you an idea about how the program is going to actually run from this point going forward. The Montgomery County Office of Human Rights and the Montgomery County Human Rights Commission and the Committee Against Hate Violence are all organizations that operate under the auspices of the Office of Human Rights. And it is in keeping with trying to bring to the community information. This is not about stating a position. This is not about sort of lining on this side or that side. This is about bringing information to the community and let you decide where you are. Because the most important thing is that you have some confidence in those who are policing you. If you've got questions about that, that you also get a chance to raise those questions as well, to the extent we're able to do so in this virtual format. So let me be real clear about this as well. Our goal is not to certainly to restrict or prohibit public participation. It was, however, to give information to those who in fact are responsible to us to provide and protect and serve here in this county. And so our objective was to give you this information, allow you then to not only deal with the questions that you already have, but also be better informed that you can ask even more questions about what you see in terms of service delivered to you by our law enforcement leaders. And so that was the objective. And the goal is to, again, make for you just an option, an opportunity to gain more education about what's going on in our county and to build upon this with hopefully future kinds of forums that look at other kinds of issues across the county. Let me also say that there was some concern that we would not have a chance then to fully appreciate the questions that you're going to ask. Let me reassure you that we will be dealing with your questions as they come in and be able then to have those then communicated to those on our panel. Let me ask if you have a very, very specific person to whom you want to have that question addressed to, please let us know that as well. But these will be your questions. I have a few. But this is about hearing from you. And so please keep that in mind as we go forward. So the program's going to work this way. We'll have a chance to ask each of our law enforcement officials to give a brief statement about their vision of policing in Montgomery County. They'll be followed up with a couple other questions that we'll be asking them as well to sort of give us a flavor for what they're currently doing, how they feel about being the leaders of their various police units and law enforcement units within Montgomery County, but also to begin to talk about how we move forward in ways of how they understand things in terms of the current activities and events of the last several weeks. So we'll get a chance to hear from them directly. And then we'll get a chance then to open up the discussion to you, those of you who are in our audience this evening, to ask your questions as well. And we're going to do that as long as we possibly can with time permitting. And then we'll do a wrap up at the end and then offer our thanks to those who helped put this broadcast together tonight. So that's our format. And so let's get started. So let me first of all do introductions of our guests this evening. And you know them, but we want to make sure we do a proper introduction to all of them. Our first guest is going to be Chief Marcus Jones, who was appointed the 17th Police Chief of the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Police in November of 2019. He is a 34-year veteran of the department and recently served as the Assistant Chief of the Investigation Unit and Bureau. He has also served as the Commander of the 3rd District, Director of Major Crimes, Drug Enforcement and Commander, and a variety of other assignments. Marcus helped to create an award-winning diversity training program for the police department, which he has taught to numerous academic classes. He has a bachelor's degree of science in business administration from the University of Maryland, University College, and he's a graduate of the FBI National Academy, section number 267, and the National Executive Institute. Chief Jones is a member of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the Maryland Chiefs Association, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. That again is Chief Marcus Jones. So we're glad that he's with us today as well. Next is also our Sheriff of Montgomery County, Sheriff Darryl Mcswain. After 12 years serving as Chief Deputy, Sheriff Darryl M. Popkins was elected as Montgomery County's Sheriff in 2010 and re-elected in 2014 and also in 2018. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Department has 160 sworn law enforcement officers, 36 civilians, providing a wide range of judicial, law, domestic violence intervention services for over 1 million people here in Montgomery County. In 2009, Sheriff Popkins was a member of the planning committee that designed the interagency Montgomery County Family Justice Center, and he continues to be involved in a number of programs designed around incidents of domestic violence in his executive management role with the Montgomery Department of, the Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Popkins is involved with law enforcement policymaking and professional organizations. He received his BA degree in law enforcement from the University of Maryland in College Park. Next, we have our Chief of the City of Rockville. Victor Brito is his name, was appointed as Police Chief of the Rockville City Police Department in June 2018. He previously served for 2 years as Chief of Police with the City of Hagerstown Police Department. Chief Brito's career also includes 25 years with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C., where he retired with the rank of captain. Throughout his career at Montgomery County Police Department, he served as the Assistant District Commander of the 7th District, Commander of the Department's Disciplinary Review District, Commander of Recruiting Branch, Director of the Metropolitan Police Academy, Commander of Synchronized Operation Command Center, a Special Investigation Branch, and the Special Operations Division. Chief Brito earned a bachelor's degree in Management and Leadership and a master's degree in Management and Community Development, both from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He's a graduate of 46 of the Law Enforcement Executive Department seminar at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Again, that's Chief Brito. Let me also now introduce you to our next person on the panel, and that's going to be Chief Mark Shaaka, City of Gaithersburg Police Department. Mark is the Chief of Police of the Gaithersburg Department of Police. He has served in this capacity since July 13th of 2010. He was previously a 24-year member of the Maryland State Police and held the rank of Major upon his retirement on July 1 of 2010. He holds a Major of Arts degree in Criminology from the University of Maryland, a Master's degree in Criminal Justice from the University of Baltimore, and is a graduate of FBI National Academy, Section 245. He's a member of the Maryland Chief of Police Association and International Association of Chief of Police and the FBI Academy Associates. Next is Chief Tony Antonio Duvall, Tacoma Park Police Department. Chief Tony, as he's referred to, was sworn in as the 14th Chief of Police for the city of Tacoma Park on January 2nd, 2018. He previously worked for the Maryland National Capital Park Police, where he retired as police chief. During his tenure with the Park Police, he worked his way up through the ranks, beginning as a patrol officer and serving in every division of the department before becoming an assistant chief and ultimately chief in 2012. Chief Duvall is a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Maryland Chiefs of Police Association, the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the FBI National Academy of Associates. Chief Duvall holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Management from Johns Hopkins University and a Master's of Science degree in Organizational Leadership, also from the Johns Hopkins. He is a graduate of the FBI National Academy, Section number 260, the Maryland Leadership Challenge, Section 21, and the FBI, Greater Chesapeake Law Enforcement Executive School, the Penn State University Police Executive Course, and many others. That's again is our Chief Tony Duvall from Tacoma Park. And next is Chief Darryl Mcswain. Chief Mcswain was appointed as the Chief of Police for the National Capital Park Police, Montgomery County Division in May of 2018. Prior to this appointment, he was a member of the Montgomery County Department of Police for 30 years before retiring as a member of the Montgomery County Department of Police. Assistant Chief, where he led the Field Service Bureau, which consists of a Crisis Response and Support Division, Animal Services, and Traffic Operations. Previous assignments included the Supervisor of the Community Outreach Section, Director of the the Internal Affairs Division, Commander of the 1st District Station, and then Director of the Special Operations Division and the Patrol Services Bureau as Assistant Chief. Chief Mcswain obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree in Criminal Justice from the University of Maryland and earned a master's degree in Administrative Management from Bowie State University. He too is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and board member of the Gateway Second Chance Foundation, which exists to provide educational opportunities and life services for the at-risk male adolescents. He and his wife, Sally, reside in Silver Springs, Maryland, and are proud parents of 4 young adults. A lot of good information about a lot of good people, and I apologize for missing on a couple of those guys. But let me just get started by first introducing again Marcus Jones. And Chief, you've got the question before you, but I want to make sure that our audience understands again what we're trying to get you to sort of focus in on. And that is, what is your vision of policing? And
go ahead.
Chief,
sorry.
Begin that process for me, Chief. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jim, and good evening to everyone. And thank you all for having me as a part of this very important discussion about policing in Montgomery County, particularly in these very difficult days. I will state out that the vision that I have for Montgomery County Police is very community engaged from a standpoint of constant engagement from our officers and understanding the community that they serve. It is vitally important in these days of community engagement that we engage in such a way that we understand our community, understand the needs in a way to protect them and serve them in a way that is very, in a sense that's respectful, with total respect for the community and the understanding of human rights and how we should move forward with that respectfully each and every day that we serve. You know, we have some challenges. Policing is very difficult, and I understand that. And I want to make sure that people understand when we talk about protecting and serving, we do it in a way of a guardian type mentality, not a warrior type of mentality. We are doing it as servant of the people because that's the goal that we set out for each and every day. What's also important is for people to understand is that the focus of our engagement in keeping our community safe does not center around, and this is something I express to officers often, it does not center on the quantity of arrests or the quantity of tickets that we give out in our communities. That is not a way of effective policing in order to go in when communities have problems that exist, particularly crime issues that are occurring in some of our most vulnerable type of communities that in many ways trust us the least. And in those areas, we must focus on the quality of our policing from a perspective that we have to focus upon What is the issue? How do we best solve it? And in many of those cases, by making arrests doesn't solve the issue. The issue becomes, do we look at the problem and look at it from a perspective of how to best solve it, getting to the root of the problem and utilizing additional partners in partnership in county government, partnership in communities, such as your HOAs, or your community groups that are connected. Those are important. And those are important for each of our commanders that oversee district command stations, that they develop relationships. And it's even important for our officers so that they have developed relationships along the way that helps them solve problems in a more effective way. So what I want to make sure that people understand is that we're not looking to put Band-Aids on problems in our communities. We're looking to solve them most effectively. And yes, we have challenges. We have, there's constant focus upon training, which I think is vitally important to the success of our department. And again, we're not perfect. We understand that, but we strive to be, to get to that point. And that's something we work hard at each every day. We are human. Our officers are human. We recognize that. And we want to work with the community in a way that is understanding that we can all come to the table. And I think the community is a vital, important part of this discussion. And for us to be successful in policing is that the community, that we're having meaningful discussions and that we have understanding on both sides of the table. And you're listening, and I'm listening most importantly, and my department is listening. And so with that being said, I want to thank you again for having the opportunity to be here tonight. And I look forward to continued conversations in regards to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So again, I'll make sure that the question is clear to our audience, and I'll make sure we just share that with you again. What I'm asking our police officials to talk about is, what is their vision and current philosophy of policing in a multiracial, multicultural, and multilingual and religious community called Montgomery County? And so that's what they're reacting to. And now we're going to have then Sheriff Popkins also respond to that question. Sheriff Popkins?
Jim, I want to thank you, the Montgomery County Human Rights Commission, and the Office of Community Partnership for the invitation to participate in this very important panel. As always, I want to thank the incredibly hardworking and dedicated staff at the Sheriff's Office, who really, when they go out on any assignment, they start with care and respect before ever getting to protect and serve. And that is a very, very important distinction. Jim, we live in a county where it is very diverse, multiracial, multilingual. Some look at this as a challenge. I believe it is Montgomery County's strength. Because of all this and the multiracial, multilingual, and the diversity, implicit bias training, cultural sensitivity, bilingual deputies, and the attempt to make our workforce mirror our community is incredibly vital. In my office, we work on that continually. It's not something that you can just try to do once and hope that it gets there. You have to continue to work on that all the time. And that really does require ongoing review. It requires reform where necessary, and it requires an ongoing dialogue between my office and certainly the community. I'm going to leave it at that point because I'm looking forward to participating and answering questions as part of this esteemed panel. I know that the public has many, many questions, and I look forward to turning this back to you and answering those questions as we move forward. So thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Sheriff Popkins. Really appreciate that very much indeed. Chief Brito's up next. Chief, your perspective on this question.
Good evening, Jim, and everyone on this call. Jim, I greatly appreciate you everything you've done since we first met. Your partnership and your empathy and your compassion for us, and understanding and direction is paramount. I think it's critically important for you, when I talk about vision and philosophy, you get to know me, Vic Brito. So I want to speak from my heart. Good policing needs our hearts right now. It needs all of our hearts. I'm the son of a first generation group of parents, and so is my wife. I've lived in Montgomery County my entire life, along with my 6 siblings, with my wife and my son too, and we all attended public schools here. I became a police officer 31 years ago because I felt an undeniable calling to protect and serve and help people in our community. This calling has only grown louder and stronger each and every day throughout my career. It's important you to understand too, is that, my philosophy and vision. So let me kind of illustrate a little story to you. When you look at a police officer, whether here be in Montgomery County in Maryland, whether it be in California, whether it be in Montana, Florida, anywhere in this country, you'll see commonalities. You'll see a uniform, you'll see a badge, you'll see a patch, you'll see a tool belt around officers' waist with numerous tools that are put there to protect our community and protect the officer. But there's one tool that is important and it rises above all. That's his or her mouths. Your ability to communicate effectively is number one. If you can't communicate effectively, you can't be a police officer. So communication, empathy, compassion is number one. Your proficiency in tools certainly is important. Your physical fitness is important, but nothing rises above your ability to communicate. If you can't communicate effectively, you're not going to be good in our profession. Our profession is not for everyone. So communication is paramount. I want to talk about 3 things also that I strive to ensure in our police department is to hire the right people. You can't get that wrong. You have to hire the right people. That's really, really important. People that want to serve, want to give of themselves, that want to be selfless, that want to help people. You have to develop and train our officers in the spirit of service and to ensure, most importantly, accountability, not only to our agency, but to our community. When you look at, our job description, many people will think it's to arrest people. Arresting people is just a very small part of what we do. Protecting the civil and human rights of all people is the foundation of our profession. You can't get that wrong. That's exactly what we do. Good policing can only be realized through sound relationships, good relationships. Police cannot ever separate ourselves from our communities that we serve. We must always be part of our communities. You hear it all the time. We have to build trust. Well, doing that takes a great deal of hard work. I know that I am, and our officers are willing to put in that hard work. Oftentimes, that's going to lead to uncomfortable conversations. That's okay, because we have to have those conversations. I talk to our officers every day. We cannot back away from a conversation. We have to run to a conversation, because when people know our hearts, they know where we're at, and they know that we're here to help them. That's the foundation. And what we must do, and we cannot do, and I will never do, is we have to understand people's truths and the failures of American policing. I teach at a very large university in Washington, D.C. on the history of American policing. Our profession has a great deal of sin, and we carry that baggage with us every day. We can't rid our baggage of it. We have to acknowledge it and work beyond it. But also what's very, very important when you look at us as police officers, not as a police chief, but as police officers, we can never, ever forget our humanity. And I will not allow my conscience to go to sleep or others. It's very, very important. Jim, thank you again for putting this together, and I'm waiting for the rest of the program. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Chief. And before we go to our next guest, we want to make very sure that we acknowledge that we are getting your questions. So as soon as we get to that portion, please bear with us. We'll get to those questions and get them on and before our guest this evening. But we also want to now take time out to recognize other council members who are on board with us. Councilmember Friedson is with us, and thank you so much, Councilmember Friedson, for all you do. Same would go then for Councilmember Raymer, Councilmember Jawando, Councilmember Navarro, and also our Vice President of Council, Tom Hucker. And so we're so glad that you are with us, and we know that this issue that we're talking about is near and dear to all of our council members' heart and their focus. And so they're really, really committed to change. And I know it's one of the themes we're going to talk about a little bit later on is what do we do from here and what can we expect to see in terms of change that goes forward from forums like this, and I suspect others that may come later on. So with that having been said, Councilmember Shaaka represents again the city of Gaithersburg, and so we want to have him also respond to this question. Chief?
Good evening, Mr. Stowe and everybody on this call. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight and to address your questions. And I think by having these continued and open conversations and this type of dialogue, this is a good first step to improving police and community relations. The philosophy of the Gaithersburg Police Department is really grounded in community policing, where we continue to work in partnership with the community to keep people safe and in striving to make the city of Gaithersburg even safer. My vision for our department is a culture that places value on continued training to include but not limited to implicit bias, cultural awareness, de-escalation, and crisis intervention training to minimize instances of officers using force, along with a culture that rewards restraint and a renewed focus on professional and compassionate policing. Understandably, there are legitimate concerns regarding policing policies and practices, ranging from use of force to bias in policing, to police accountability and transparency. These are issues that are rightly at the heart of any community's relationship with its police department, and it must be addressed. The fundamental duty of a police officer is to serve people, to safeguard lives. Gaithersburg police officers are committed to professional policing by providing quality service and protection to all people in an efficient and competent manner, tempered with courtesy, compassion, and understanding. Our officers, they uphold the public trust through honest, consistent, and forthright interaction with all people in order to foster an atmosphere of mutual trust and cooperation, and by treating all people with dignity and respect. I want to reassure the community that regardless of the challenges the police and society face, the Gaithersburg Police Department will remain committed to serving and protecting the community. And we will continue to be guided by our core values of service, integrity, and respect. The citizens expect it, and we expect it of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief. We're going to punt here in our dialogue, and I'm going to ask the remaining two chiefs to respectfully hold a little bit on their particular reflections. And I want to get to some questions here from our community and get those engaged. And if you will, we'll come back then and have a chance both for, again, Chief Tony and also Chief Mcswain to also be able to react to this first question. But the first question up from our community, we're going to get to that and we'll just go with that in mind for a couple of questions for the community. We'll get back, as I mentioned. First question up is from AV. Are there community review boards? Police can investigate their own. Who wants to respond to that? Chief Jones.
Sorry about that, Jim. I was trying to get there to answer that question. So there are currently in Montgomery County, there are no community review boards. But what we do have is when we talk about investigating our own, we do have an internal affairs division that does conduct the investigation, and I hold them, and they work directly under me, and I hold them extremely responsible for that responsibility that they have, and in conducting fair and impartial investigations upon complaints. All of our use of force body-worn camera incidents are reviewed by our executive officers. And if we find that there's anything that's outside of the policy, we will look into that matter. And we have brought charges against officers that were not complaints from the community or the individual that it involved, but it was brought by our rank and file to address that use of force that we thought was excessive, and we have penalized officers as a result of that. So I would disagree that we cannot police our own. I think that individuals who care about policing, about doing it the right way, and we have a lot of officers, including myself, who hold officers to the highest degree of accountability based upon the rules that have been set in place. And I actively and with enthusiasm, to the degree of having to address issues to make sure that our officers are doing it the right way, and not to just only to be punitive, but to address and correct behavior when necessary. So there are wide varieties of way we do that, but the reality is that there is a system in place that we do conduct these investigations, and we do penalize our officers in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you, Chief. Next question, I'm going to ask Chief Mcswain to come in on this one. Is there a plan, this is SJ, is there a plan to share metrics about officers who have been disciplined and inform the community as to whether or not they have been reassigned? Does that exist here in Montgomery County?
Jim, internally in the Park Police, there are two divisions, as people may know, both the Montgomery and the Prince George's County division. And on a monthly basis, we share with each division disciplinary matters that have been resolved for that respective month, more so for transparency between the divisions and obviously for consistency in the process. I do know that metrics, there are metrics within the Park Police as it relates to certain types of offenses and the recommended outcomes, if you will, for those that are sustained. But I think sometimes also metrics in and of themselves can be somewhat limiting, in that I believe every single incident should be considered in the totality of its circumstances. So I think that's important. So for example, two individuals can commit the same offense, but if for one of them, they're coming before you for the fifth time, obviously that should be approached differently as opposed to someone that's maybe come for the first time. And there may be other extenuating circumstances that brought about a certain offense for another individual. So I think all those things are very important. Metrics are being put out there, matrices, et cetera, to try to find some degree of fairness and consistency amongst individuals. But ultimately, I think, as Chief Jones mentioned before, still talking about human beings. And as much as we would probably like for human beings to be perfect and or for things to fit in a nice, clean box, doesn't always happen. You always have to realize there are many, many other underlying issues that we also have to deal with, while still being accountable to the public we serve on a daily basis.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going now to Chief Tony, the next question, and it comes from Chris Page, who is with our Community Mediation Services, the Conflict Resolution Center of Montgomery County. And he says this, Chief, the Maryland Training Commission has recommended the use of police complaint mediation as an alternative dispute resolution process for many nonviolent police complaints and a way to build community in a peaceful way. would you be willing or interested in using police complaint mediation as an alternative dispute process? Again, that goes to Chief Tony.
Absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel. Ironically enough, we're already pursuing this in the city of Tacoma Park. We felt it was very important to have this as an option for our officers. For a lot of the complaints we come in are complaints of discourtesy that can be mediated between the complainant and the officer. So we are already in the process of pursuing that. We are in the final stages of rolling that out. I think it's absolutely beneficial. I think a lot of times when these complaints come in, a complainant complains about something for discourtesy of an officer addressed them in a certain fashion. They file a complaint with the police department and they never really hear anything back. So they really get no resolution. So Elizabeth Wallace, who's on my chief's advisory board, spearheaded this. She did a lot of research and really pushed this. So we're working through this. We're going to work with community mediation to set that up here in the city of Tacoma Park. But I think it's important, number one, for transparency, but also for resolution. Because a lot of times, residents might not understand why certain officers interact in a certain way. Why did they flash the flashlight on me on a traffic stop in the middle of the night? And a lot of times it's helpful for the officer as well to understand the impact their interaction had with that particular resident. So to answer the question, absolutely. Here in the city of Tacoma Park, we are open to that and pursuing that type of mediation.
Thank you, Chief. Really appreciate that answer. We've got another question coming up here. And this question is from Scott. Do officers feel comfortable speaking up if they see misconduct? Will they be supported by their supervisors if they do?
I'm still up. I can answer it if you like.
Please go ahead.
All of our police departments have a requirement for officers, a duty to intervene if they see something that another officer does. So absolutely, each one of our agencies, I feel very confident that if officers see something similar to what happened in Minneapolis, they're going to step up. We hold officers accountable for their actions or inactions. If they're dealing with an individual that's doing something, they observe an officer mistreat an individual, they observe an officer abuse an individual, they observe an egregious act like that in Minneapolis. But what's really important is to stress a culture where people are comfortable coming forward and advising administration of events like this. Because traditionally, there's been that thin blue line, and officers did not feel comfortable coming forward because they'd be ostracized from other officers. So we want to create a culture not only with the administration where they're supported, but also within other officers that they're supported. I and all the other chiefs on the call are going to hold individuals just as accountable if they see an officer doing some wrongdoing and don't report it. Just as the officers in Minneapolis were just as culpable that stood by for 9 minutes and allowed that to happen. So I'm hoping that all of our agencies, through the culture of the agencies, are setting up systems so officers feel comfortable coming forward when they see behavior that's contrary to what we would like to see from our other officers.
Thanks, Chief. Chief Brito, you're up next. Are officers actually taught de-escalation tactics? We so often see them in these environments, in these situations. And so the question from Kat is, are officers actually taught the skill sets, de-escalation tactics?
Absolutely. And Jim, that's a great question. Let me turn off. Jim, I'm trying to turn off my video. Okay, I think I got it. We good?
You're good, Chief. Go ahead.
Good. That's a very good question, Jim. And let me phrase it this way: is that number one, we are specifically we receive a lot of that training through our academy, through recruit training, through in-service training, and development. But what I've done here with the Rockville City Police Department, I brought in a national model through PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum. It's called ICAT, Integrated Communications and Tactics. And I trained every single member of my police department on a best practice, that model of de-escalation. Very, very important for us to slow things down. Time and distance is very, very important in our profession. The closer you get to a situation, the more dangerous it gets. So you have to give yourself time and distance whenever practical. But the ICAP model was a great model for the Rockville City Police Department, something that I championed here for our officers. Very, very important for us in our community. All those tools and all that development is critical in our decision making. So yes, de-escalation is taught, actually taught at another level. We brought it up a notch, which is important. Our community deserves it and our officers deserve it.
Thank you, Chief. Sheriff Popkins, this is from Ruben. What kind of public satisfaction surveys are you performing, and how do you measure what the public feels works well or needs improvement? What kind of public satisfaction surveys are you performing, and how do you measure what the public feels works well and or needs improvement? Sheriff Popkins.
Okay, Jim.
Yes, Sheriff.
Yeah, we had a little technical glitch there, but many of the agencies on the phone are part of the commission CALIA. It's our accrediting standards, and these sort of surveys that go out to the public and then get returned in certain customers type surveys are incredibly important on a yearly basis, because that's the only way we know how we're doing. I do want to just mention, Jim, on a couple of the prior questions having to do with de-escalation and the use of force reporting. Over the last several years, I have an opportunity to spend a lot of time in Annapolis on legislation and co-chairing the legislative committee for the Maryland Chiefs and Sheriffs. And these are laws that we are working on, bills that we work on yearly with the legislators. So there are reporting requirements for use of force cases. There are reporting requirements now for disciplinary that we have to report out to the Maryland Police and Standards Commission each year. There are actual death reporting now in the state of Maryland. So we have made some really great strides over the last several years, but we still have a long way to go on the legislative front. But many of the questions that have been brought up, for example, like de-escalation, that is a required training now that has to go on in each entry-level academy, as well as in-service training that all police officers throughout the state of Maryland must have. So I just wanted to let you know that, some of these questions, that have been asked are really tremendously great questions. But these are the reforms that we have been working on with our local legislators and our state legislators to try to get these things put in place. And now they are not only by policy, but by state law. So thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Sheriff. Our next question up is going to be for, let's go to the city of Gaithersburg with this question. Chief Katie wants to know, how have the current events with police officers and the African-American community changed your conversation with your officers?
Can you hear me, Jim?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Chief.
Okay. The conversations I've had with my officers began with, it doesn't matter where misconduct occurs by a police officer. It can occur anywhere in this country. And when a police officer violates his or her oath of office and then engage in excessive force or any misconduct whatsoever, that reflects discredit on every police officer across this country. And it brings the reputation of the police profession into disrepute. So it's important to treat everybody with respect and dignity. And even in the absence of an officer not knowing a particular law or a particular departmental policy, they have to just stop and ask themselves, what is the right thing to do? And that's where we hold ourselves to the right standard, not necessarily a higher standard. What is the right thing to do? How would you want to be treated if you were stopped or your family was stopped by a police officer? You know, those are the kind of conversations where it's humanizing people and treating people there with just courtesy and just human dignity. And it's more personalized. You know, we're all people as police officers. We take off this uniform, we're all moms and dads and brothers and sisters. So at the end of the day, we have to get this right and figure out how we can continue and improve upon partnering with the community so people don't fear us. Because right now what concerns me is, and in particular in the Black community, people are scared of the police because they think the police are brutal and going to use, unnecessary and excessive force. And what I can tell you in 35 years, that is not representative of the roughly 900,000 police officers in this nation that are working in about 18,000 police departments across our country. Most police officers serve with honor and distinction. However, those officers that betray the community's trust, they disgrace this entire profession. And I remain committed to doing my part along with my colleagues on this call, because we're all unified in this, to go ahead and root out the bad officers, to prevent what happened in Minneapolis and elsewhere from occurring anywhere in Montgomery County. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Mcswain, question for you. Coming from the NAACP, and the question is this: please indicate whether a civilian who is not driving a vehicle is required to produce an identification when requested by a police officer. Not driving, in the car, is that person required to present a identification if asked by a police officer? And part two is, what is the protocol in each jurisdiction if a civilian does not have an identification available?
It all depends on the circumstances, Jim. Generally, we don't ask just anybody within the vehicle for identification for no purpose. Generally, one needs to tie something to that stop that would give you reasonable suspicion to basically ask the identity of a certain individual who has nothing to do with driving a car. Obviously, we can get into a number of different circumstances, but that will probably be the short and long of the response itself. Certainly, I'll allow my colleagues to share maybe if they have certain expertise due to some other work that they've done, but that's the general gist as it relates to how we believe that people should be treated. And quite frankly, should be treated just whether you're an 18-year-old adolescent male or 52-year-old Asian female, you should be treated the same and respectfully in any circumstance.
Others in the jurisdiction, how would you handle a person who may not have his or her actual identification papers with them at the time of the request? What's the protocol? Chief Tony.
It depends on the circumstances. Are you referring to, if you're referring to a traffic stop, we would do our best to try to ascertain through other means. I mean, a lot of times people are running out to get milk late at night, and they may run out and not just have, the cash they need or credit card, might not have their ID. We traditionally try to do our best to identify who the person is. If the person can give their name and date of birth and where they live, we normally can run it through our databases to ascertain if that's the person. We do not have remote fingerprint kits that we use. Normally, under circumstance of a traffic stop, we would just try to figure out who the individual was through other investigative means. Like I said, through running through an MBA database, seeing who the car is, and so on and so forth. And as far as passengers in vehicles, I concur with Chief Mcswain. I don't know any agency. Our agency does not require people, unless there's an investigative purpose, to produce their identification on a traffic stop. It's just, unless there's some type of criminal investigatory part of it. But if it's a simple traffic stop for a taillight out, there's no. Our officers are not going to ask any passengers in vehicles to produce their identification.
Thanks, Chief. Chief Jones, what about here in Montgomery County at large?
It's consistent with what the other two chiefs have noted. You know, Jim, is if you don't have your identification on you, an officer is going to ask you for your name, your full name, and date of birth in order to try to best identify you to the best of their ability. As long as, and again, depending upon what the circumstances are, they will, you know, take that information and try to verify it. And if it seems to match up, then they will proceed. If there's something that doesn't appear to be consistently right with the information that you've given them, and there's some information that seems to be a little bit, or maybe seem that the individual is being a little bit, you know, from a standpoint of they're not coming clean with the officer, then there may be some other actions that the officer might take, such as what we call the mobile APHIS system that allows us to potentially identify some individuals by their fingerprint. That gives us an automatic information that hit if that person's information is in the database. All individuals' names are not there, so that's not 100% accurate, but that gives us a better opportunity to try to identify the person. But that's only in the case of sort of when individuals are not coming clean with officers to give them the proper information.
Thank you, Chief. While you're there, Chief, just stay with us a little bit. Got a question from, I think I'm mispronouncing the name here, but I'm gonna try, Tasnuva. And the question is there a commitment or plan to demilitarize our police departments? There's a sense that there is this military flavor and tactic to the actual involvement of police sometimes with communities. And so the question is there a commitment to demilitarize our police where these kinds of reputations exist, if they're not reality?
I think so. I think at the end of the day, you know, traditionally law enforcement has been under a paramilitary system. And there's a reason for that. I mean, when it comes to rank structure. But again, I think that as we look at many of the other different functions of the police department and how we move forward with doing the different functions and engagement and changing some of the equipment that we deal with, and we try not to be so militaristic, if that's a term I could use, to show that consistent comparison with other military functions in our government. So I believe that there are ways to do that. You know, we want to do the best to give our officers the protection they need, and when they are on the front lines and the jobs that they do, with the type of equipment that they wear. And that's something that's very important, because we hear from the officers, and there's evidence of officers being injured and killed, in fact, in the line of duty. Again, we try to give them the best equipment possible that protects them from possible serious injury or death in that regard. So I would agree that there are ways that we can do that and improve upon that. And I think it's something we constantly talk about and look at.
Thanks, Chief. Chief Mcswain, there's a lot of concern now about the issue of mental health and whether or not police are qualified to be engaged in those arrests and those attempts to actually find themselves in situations where mental health may be an issue. Eileen has this question. What mental health evaluations and support services are in place for officers? What is the process for managing removal or reassignment due to mental illness? Again, what mental health evaluations and support services are in place for officers? And what is the process for managing removal or assignment due to mental illness? Chief Mcswain.
Thank you, Jim. I think I'm here. All right. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the question. It's a very unique and real question for us in public safety today, and probably even that much more acute than has been in the past. And certainly if our corrections personnel were on the line here today, they'd be able to talk about how much more or how many more individuals who are in our prison system now that have some type of coexisting issue, whether it's mental illness issues, et cetera, that the public that we deal with. However, for the police officers, it's just as important an issue for us to also deal with in terms of wellness, officer wellness and safety. Officers and deputies are asked to deal with issues that most people don't have to on a regular basis, whether they've seen some type of horrific incident and or just a repeated amount of times they may have to deal with some type of trauma. One of the things that we're really trying to do in public safety now is reduce the stigma behind getting some help. Because let's face it, if you get the help early on, chances are it's not going to manifest to a point where it leads to some type of tragedy. So our focus has been to reduce the stigma across the board in all of public safety, whether it be police or fire. And one of the things that we're doing is, one, making access to whether it be mental health assistance, financial assistance, family counseling issues. Again, we're talking about people who are human beings and have real human issues, to get some help, not only anonymously, but of course also free of charge. And not only for the officers or deputies themselves, but also for their immediate family members as well, because they're the ones who have to go through some of these issues with them. And if they have that support, it makes it that much more important. So one of the things that we're doing is we're mandating that every single one of our officers and non-sworn staff go through crisis intervention training. We used to allow for that for those who would be possessing like a taser or something like that, or some type of electronic control device. But we felt that the training was so important that it should actually be extended to every single individual. Not only does it help them to identify signs of mental illness, but also how to deal with it more effectively. We've expanded our internal peer support. Sometimes officers are not comfortable going to either immediate bosses, if you will, and or government officials. They may just simply feel more comfortable going to a peer. So we're expanding those who have that specialty training in our peer support group. And then when they're involved in some type of traumatic incident, instead of leaving it up to the employee to determine if they're going to get assistance, we've made it mandatory that they have to go seek some type of psychological assessment, if you will. And then, of course, some type of report comes back to the chief, but it's anonymous in the sense that it doesn't go anywhere else outside of the chief himself. There's no details about the treatment itself, only that the officer actually got the treatment and that they've been cleared to essentially continue to function in the capacity that they were in before being released. By making it mandatory, it again removes the stigma that someone's going to get help because they're so quote unquote weak. Is simply the right thing to do. And I think it will help to encourage more people to get assistance and help sooner than later.
Thank you, Chief. Sheriff Popkin, question from you, for you, I should say. Elizabeth wants to know, do you feel it's important that a police officer or a deputy, their legal conduct while not on the job should be made public?
Their legal conduct, I'm not really sure I have an understanding of the question, Jim.
And I probably read, Chief, I probably read that question wrong, so I apologize to Elizabeth. What she's asking is, do you feel that important that a police officer's illegal conduct while not on the job should be made public?
Well, there's no doubt that, under, all of our rules and regulations, any police officer, any deputy sheriff who does something illegal and gets caught for it, certainly is subject to the same public information release as anybody else who's arrested for any other subject matter. This is clear. There is nothing that we would, try to hide or cover up. I mean, there is no difference between a law enforcement officer getting arrested or somebody who's not a law enforcement as far as the public information release of that person. We are certainly, hope to have few and far between with that. We also, sometimes police officers get in trouble that aren't criminal trouble, but they have administrative violations against them. And those are also in aggregate reported to the state. But I want you to know that, we try to, there is a barrier in state law right now that any sort of disciplinary record of a police officer is considered a personnel record. So in Minnesota, when that incident occurred, you found out that that police officer had multiple complaints against him. The chiefs in Maryland are not allowed to release any of that information because of barrier in state law. So, these are some barriers that I point out only because I think it needs to continue the dialogue from a legislative perspective, because that's information that should be put out, whether legal or administrative.
Thanks, Sheriff. Chief Tony, Byron wants to know, do you support committee review boards with subpoena power?
Let me say this, what's on the table now in the state of Maryland, I do support a civilian sitting on a trial board, an LEOBR, Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights trial board. I think that creates a lot of transparency. I've been open in the past in supporting that. I'd have to see the certain structure. There are various structures of review boards, but I support having individuals outside of law enforcement involved in review of our internal complaints. I think it goes to transparency, inclusiveness. So to answer your question, yes, I do support having civilians as part of that process. I'd have to know the particular structure of the certain review board, but if someone was, yeah, obviously having the ability to have subpoena power would be paramount to be able to ascertain the facts and circumstances of the case.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Jones, your reaction.
Yeah, I think Tony is right in the way he has described that. I would agree very similar along the lines with him. With us, it's unique, particularly as you have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights that basically sets out what is how an officer's discipline hearing is actually heard. So there's a lot of discussion that needs to go into how would we restructure a system of as we deal with complaints and discipline when it comes to addressing those issues and moving forward on our hearing boards and the communities being a part of that. And I think it needs to be, it's worth the discussion of some involvement. But it also requires, I think, also that there needs to be police officers that are on these boards and people who have some understanding as well with law enforcement practices and policies.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Shaaka, SJ wants to know, are body cam videos stored forever or deleted regularly? Are they ever randomly reviewed as part of an audit? Body cams. Chief?
Jim, if you can hear me, I'm getting a message that the host has stopped the video. Okay, they put it up.
Go ahead, Chief. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So if I heard the question, it was, are body worn cameras reviewed?
Our body cam, yes, our body cameras, our body cams, I should say, videos, the videos we're talking about now, are they stored forever or deleted regularly? And are they ever randomly reviewed as part of an audit?
Yes. Every officer in the Gaithersburg Police Department is issued a body worn camera, and it must be turned on each time that an officer has an interaction with a citizen when they're engaged in police function. The retention period for the body worn cameras videos is 366 days. We established that length of that period of time based on complaint investigations where the chief can impose disciplinary action. The chief can only impose disciplinary action it must be imposed within 1 year from the time the chief learns of the allegation of misconduct. So since we have a year to impose disciplinary action, once we're made aware of it, we extended the body worn camera footage tape retention period by 1 additional day for 366 days. In regard to the reviews are done by first line supervisors randomly for the patrol officers on their shift. And it's also reviewed by each bureau commander holds the rank of lieutenant as a second check to ensure that officers are conducting themselves in conformance with the rules and regulations of the department.
Thank you, Chief. To all of you, want to thank you so much for being a part of this process. A couple more questions. We're coming to the close of our time together this evening, but hiring practices. Chief, you're on the line with us already, so why don't you go ahead and kind of deal with that, if you will. What are the hiring practices, and how do you determine who is that right person? We heard Chief Brito say earlier, I want to get him on this question as well, about this idea of hiring the right person. Your thoughts?
Yes, Chief Bird is absolutely correct. If you hire good people, they can be trained to be good police officers. It doesn't work in reverse. So we want people that are mature, that are psychologically stable, have real world experiences, showed an ability to resolve conflict without violence. We look at the number, what their history is. Do they have a criminal history? What is their driving record like? By background investigations, we determine, how many fights have they actually been, physical altercations that they be in? What are the circumstances surrounding that? What is their family life and background, like how they were raised? We look at their education level. We look at their grade point average on as well. So we check with their neighbors, former employers. It's a comprehensive background. It usually takes a minimum of 6 months to do, and we try to learn as much as we can about the applicant. In my department, since I know that the quality of an organization will never exceed the quality of its personnel, I'm involved in that hiring process from the physical fitness testing. And at the end of the entire process, I make the final decision on who gets hired. Because I know at the end of the day, the most important asset that any police agency has are the people that work in the organization.
Chief, thank you so much for that. Chief Brito, this is right up your alley, and the question is this. Are there, let me make sure I get it together here and say exactly how it's being asked, so I won't do it justice here. This is the issue of right to know kinds of community events and training sessions and so forth. Are those the kind of things that you are involved with directly for the city of Rockville? And do you recommend those as a way to have community involved to really understand police procedure and police conduct? Your thoughts?
Oh, Jim, that's a great question. And the answer is really simple. Absolutely. Everything that we do we should be able to articulate every single action we do, every policy, everything we do. If we cannot articulate it, we should remove it. We should always be transparent with everything we do, all of our policies, our procedures, our training. We invite our community to come in through it, whether it be citizen police academies, whether it be ride-alongs, or whether just regular interactions to talk about what we do as an agency and everything we do. The right to know is nothing that we do here we should have behind a curtain. Everything is open for the sun to shine in and see everything that we do each and every day. So absolutely, Jim, the public has the right to know everything that we do. So that's a really easy answer for me, because when the public knows what we do, how we do it, that's when we build relationships. That's when we build understanding about how we do things in law enforcement. It's critically important. That is probably one of the most important things we do. We cannot be secular from our community. We have to be a part of it, and being a part of it is sharing what we do and how we do it and when we do it and why we do it, most importantly. And if we can't articulate those questions, then we got to rethink about what we're doing. So absolutely, a right to know is paramount.
Chief, while you're there, thank you so much for that answer. The question has come up about those who are doing off-duty kinds of assignments. In that capacity, they still wear the uniform. So they still are associated with your department, whether or not they actually are working for you at that time or not. There may also be issues of fatigue, as an example, for persons who are working these special shifts, these special sort of side jobs. How does that play into their being fit for the regular job they have for the city of Rockville in your case? And also the question arises, are there procedures, or is there a protocol? Because oftentimes our young people talk about being harassed by these persons when they're at movie theaters and when they're out and about at restaurants and so forth. So help us understand the whole sort of culture around off-duty policing.
Sure. That's a good question. Different agencies have different models. When I was in Washington, D.C., we had more of a total control model that if you were wearing our uniform, we controlled and had to approve each and every off-duty employment that you worked. We have very rigorous requirements in the city of Rockville regarding our off-duty employment. What the requirements are, where they're working, making sure they're working for the right establishment, making sure there's no discredit upon the agency. And they are still held to the standards of policy, procedures, and our general orders, whether they're working their full-time job or they're working part-time. But please understand is that the primary job for a police officer, while I appreciate their ability to want to work outside employment, and a lot of officers do because they want to supplement their income for their families. I greatly appreciate that. But when you're wearing our uniform, we control what transpires in the Rockville City Police Department. Other agencies have different rules and regulations. So it goes through an approval process through the chain of command through me for ultimately approval for those off-duty employment or secondary employment jobs. That's a very good question. Your second question regarding fatigue, that's a real factor also. So we constantly want to monitor that about officers who like to work. A lot of police officers like to work a lot of overtime, and I applaud them for that. But there's also a wellness factor there too, is you have to get rest and you have to be prepared for your primary job, and that would be the primary job here for the Rockville City Police Department. So it's a balancing act to balance that and understand that there's only 24 hours in a day and you must get rest, and your fatigue could have an impact on your primary job. So that's a significant balancing act for us. But we do have very rigorous policies and procedures. But understand also, Jim, is that different agencies have different secondary employment policies, and not all of them are the same. And that's something that if you look throughout this country, it's fragmented, not only regionally but locally. So everybody's a little bit differently. Everybody polices secondary employment a little bit differently.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Tony, the question for you is this, and of course, a number of chiefs have talked about this idea of hiring the right person. how do you weed out the wrong person? You got him or her on your particular force right now. They're in the community, and they may or may not be an asset at this point in time. So how does that work?
Absolutely. That's just as important as hiring quality people. Holding people accountable for their actions is paramount. We make sure we keep track of all of our disciplinary actions through a database, which is called IA Pro. So we know whether or not officers have a history of bad behavior. When I was with the Park Police here at the Tacoma Park Police, we have not hesitated to root out officers that should not be here. If I can just touch on hiring real quick, one thing that we didn't touch on is the importance of hiring officers that reflect the demographics of the community in which we serve, how important that is to hire people that have the diversity, speak the various languages, look like the people that we serve. But when it comes to rooting out officers that are not doing the right thing, we absolutely need to make sure that we're holding them to task, doing thorough investigations, not letting stuff fall through the cracks. One bad officer who is not, their behavior is not addressed thoroughly is going to continue that perpetual flow. They're going to have an impact on the officers here. So I and the other chiefs on the call are all committed to holding our officers to a high standard. And if they do something, I'm going to be the first person to hold them accountable for their actions. And if it's that egregious, they're going to be fired. I tell you, the one thing that has not been touched on this evening a lot is the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights and how sometimes that restricts us as chiefs in imposing discipline or going about the disciplinary process. I know we don't have a lot of time tonight to talk about it, but those of you who are interested, the entire District 20 delegation and the Tacoma Park City Council is going to address the issues with LEOBR next Tuesday night in a virtual town hall. But that's a really important topic to talk about, is how the LEOBR restricts our ability as chiefs to impose punishment and also to be transparent in that punishment.
Thank you, Chief. And we are about to wrap it up. I do want one more comment if I can, and I'm asking for Chief Mcswain on this real quickly, and it's not a real quick answer in terms of the question I'm about to ask, but why do you think it took a George Floyd, his death and murder, to move us to a place from a law enforcement standpoint where we see some bold initiatives occurring all across the country? Many things have already happened to us here before in our own communities. Robert White, others who have been involved in issues and concerns of injury by police officers. Why did it take this particular situation to move forward? Chief Mcswain.
Jim, I can see my audio is up, but the video will not come up. I think you may have to change it on your start. Okay, there we go.
Go ahead, Chief.
I think the reason why the George Floyd incident has moved so many people, a combination of things, one of which is the fact that this is one in a long line of too many others that occur, quite frankly. And of course, one is bad enough. But when you start thinking about the actual volume, whether you go all the way back to issues in LA 20 years ago, et cetera, up until now, just the volume alone, I think, has been challenging. But the other issue is the manner in which it occurred. You know, when I say 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it means so much more to us today than it did 3 weeks ago. When you think about what that man went through. When I first heard about it, I was actually out of town. I was watching it on a television in Florida. And my immediate reaction to that issue was deep sadness, literally to a point where tears came to my eyes. But it didn't come to my eyes just simply because I'm a public safety executive or a father of four, but just as a human being. So I believe that has been really, that combination of those two things have really led people to ask the question, how do we prevent something like this from ever occurring again? I think there's a couple of things that have already been touched on tonight. The hiring practices, it's already emphasized to us. We've got to put more emphasis in the hiring process. Look for people who have greater empathy willing to work with community members who don't look like them, communication skills, even more women. Women bring a fresh perspective and they're problem solvers in what they do. Training standards need to change. I always try to remind people that in this nation, there are literally thousands of agencies, and that means different hiring standards, training, and accountability. And what the public is saying is, regardless of where you are, we want to ensure that you're exercising best practices, hiring the people that should be working with us, as Chief Jones mentioned before, guardians as opposed to those simply looking to lord over people, but then also putting into place accountability measures so that we stop certain things at the earliest stages. And then the last thing I would mention as well, I think is just as important that we've seen as well, there's a large number of young people in the younger generation who have actually gotten involved, and I think that's a great sign. It worked during the civil rights movement, and I believe it's our responsibility as this generation to prepare them for, to be tomorrow's legislators, policymakers, and community leaders. They are less enamored with things like race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic differences. And I believe it's going to be that group that really shows us what a more perfect union looks like. I believe it's going to be that group that's going to usher in what it truly means to say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. It just so happens on May 31st, I was taking my daughter back, as I wrap up, to the Midwest where she goes to school, my 20-year-old, where she goes to college. We had to move her stuff out of her college dorm into storage before we flew back. And it just so happens on May 31st that we actually flew into the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. So after getting our rental vehicle, I purposely used it as an educational moment for her. Understanding again, it will be her generation that will take us to the next level. And I chose to drive her through the location where the actual incidents began as far as Minneapolis. And ultimately, what it looks like when people feel marginalized, betrayed, and no voice at the table, and also when there's a sense of hopelessness. So I believe a combination of things have galvanized people for all the right reasons. And certainly every police chief and agency that's represented on this call is walking with them to ensure that hopefully we never have another George Floyd incident occur again.
Chief, thank you so much for that. And I'm looking for my folks to let me back in as well. There we go. Thank you ever so much. We have come to the close of this particular session. There was one last point we wanted to certainly to cover before we close out. We're a little over now with our time, so we beg your indulgence. But Chief Jones, I as a member of this community, and I as a Black man need you to address this. There is still the frequency of Black men and brown men specifically being stopped at a higher rate than it is other persons in our community. What is being done to either better sensitize officers around this issue? I know that maybe the preponderance in terms of stops sometimes involve a greater number of us, maybe than others, but nonetheless, it still comes out that a George Floyd can happen, and persons felt okay to do it. They were given permission to do it in this society. I need you to help me with that a little bit. What are we doing in our own county to ensure then that every person, as Chief Mcswain just talked about, is in fact treated as an individual and not categorized or classified or somehow or another putting together a group of those maybe they encountered beforehand and now are encountering again? Please help us with this piece. What are you doing? What are we doing here in Montgomery County to make real sure that we are addressing that? So
thank you, Jim, for allowing me to address that. You know, one of the things I will tell you, I have been dedicated to this position. I mean, as chief of police for the past year, within the past year in a way that really goes back to when I started here. And I want to say this, you know, as an African American male, before I even became a police officer, I had always been given values that I was raised by, and how to treat people, no matter the circumstance of an individual. My grandparents raised me, and I will tell you, they gave me a great platform, and my parents as well, as they supported me to give me the understanding of how to give back to people, but also how to treat people and treat people with respect and not take advantage of people in any given way. And I've brought that along with me. And I brought that with our cultural diversity training that we trained all of our department with that. And we continue to provide that type of training and implicit bias training, and to make note and make sure our not only our officers are held accountable, but now we are working in more ingrained in making sure our supervisors are also being held accountable. And I will tell you, you know, we've also instituted taking our police officers to the National African American Museum in the Smithsonian downtown. We do it for each of our recruit classes. We have taken our executive officers in order to educate our officers to make sure that they understand history. When you don't understand history, you are bound to repeat it. And so people have to understand the circumstances of suffering. Here we have officers that were born literally in the 1990s who didn't experience a lot of what went on in the previous years about racial issues throughout this country, and maybe never had to deal with that. And so we have to, again, make sure that we are educating our officers to understand the communities that they serve, the different multicultural communities that we have, and how the different cultures deserve our respect, deserves us to be able to understand and educate ourselves about them to help us have better relationships. So those are the things that I will tell you, and I'll end on this note. As Mr. Elrich noted earlier in his comments, is that I have, and I brought this to him, that we would have a racial audit of this department to look at our practices and to look at what are, if there are things that we are doing wrong, how do we correct them? And what are recommendations and findings? And we're going to make that known to the public when we do that. And I think that's vitally important. Instead of me just giving you all these words, I think it's more important that there's more of a defined look into the practices of policing here in Montgomery County. And I committed myself to doing that, and we are going to do that in a fair way. That an independent view will be vitally important for this discussion.
Chief, thank you so much for that. As we close out, I want to thank you, Chief Jones, and I want to thank also Sheriff Darren Hopkins, who made some special arrangements to be here with us this evening. I want to thank him particularly for that. Thank you, Sheriff. Also for Chief Tony and Chief Victor Brito, and also Chief Mark Shaaka and Chief Mcswain. All of you just did an enormous job in sharing directly. We didn't dodge any questions. I literally read every question that was put before us, and we tried to take on the tough questions, and we want to make very sure that our public deserves that. They deserve to hear from you who are hired to protect and serve, but also lead those who work and serve and work with you to also be the best stewards of that particular phrase. And so we thank you for what you do, and we appreciate that very much indeed. We also want to thank, in his absence, Chief John Fitzgerald. He's with the village of Chevy Chase, who called us just today with a family emergency. We hope that everything's okay with his family, but in doing so, he could not be with us here. And so we want to certainly keep him in our thoughts as well. Thank all of you and all the technical folks who are behind this broadcast today. Thank you so much for putting in the work ahead of time, and then for this evening actually having it unfold. And to all of you who are members of our community who participated by asking questions, we want to thank you as well. And we hope that this was a unique opportunity. This is why I wanted to bring this to you, because so often you believe and think then that only Montgomery County Police end up policing you. But there are other authorities out there that in fact do that job as well. And so we wanted to bring to you an opportunity to see all of them at one place and one time to ask your questions and hopefully get answers. Now, here is the big question for our chiefs as they leave. And unfortunately, we're not going to deal with it right now, but we're going to come back. We're going to come back and start with this question. Folks are asking, we get together all the time and have these opportunities for these gatherings and these coming together, these discussions and town halls and public forums. And the question folks are asking out there is they want to see, let me ask it differently. They're asking, where is the change? Where is the evidence that whatever you would have heard, whatever you would have experienced by virtue of the testimony, and in this case, the questions coming from our community, how is it going to impact what you do tomorrow, next week, next year? We really are looking for that kind of leadership in the group we have on with us tonight. And so again, we want the evidence. We want the evidence that in fact you heard our community, and we heard you because you're going to begin to see some of the things that you talked about as issues and concerns in the way we police tomorrow and the next day and the next day going forward. So again, thank all of you for being here. We've got, we believe, a good idea. There were some of you who did not get your questions addressed, but we're going to take all of these questions and put them in a frequently asked question kind of document. And there will be an opportunity for those who were not able to join us this evening, and for those of you who actually had questions, to have your questions seen and also be answered by our group. And so it may be a reference point going forward. So we're going to try to get that done as well. If this was of meaning to you and of importance to you, please, to our community, let us know that by feedback. We want to do it again if in fact there is a desire and a real wanting for that to happen. And so please let us know that. Get with us by way of feedback and let us know exactly how you felt about tonight's production. We're always trying to learn. We're always trying to give information to our community, and that's what this is really all about. Again, it is not ours as the Office of Human Rights, the Human Rights Commission, nor the Committee Against Hate Violence to take a position on these kinds of things. This is not about choosing sides tonight. It was about giving you, the community, information, and we believe that's critically important. So to all of our chiefs, again, thank you so much. Sheriff Popkins, thank you. And to all of you who joined us by way of a number of sources today, whether it's live streaming or whether it was Facebook or Twitter, thank you all for being here, and good evening.
Thank you, Jim.